Well, hello, everybody. I'm David Chack, a professor at the theater school at DePaul University, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the Miami Jewish Film Festival virtual speaker series event. We're thrilled to have director Oren Jacoby with us today, who will be talking about the film on Broadway. So now, before we begin, I want you to know that you will have a chance to ask Oren or me any questions you may have, but after our discussion, because we're going to have a bit of a discussion for 20 minutes. If you have a question, we would like you to please find the raise hand button on your screen, and you will be called upon in the order you press the button. And then please make sure to unmute yourself when it's your turn to ask a question. So let's begin. Oren, it's great talking with you today and continuing our conversations.
Great to talk to you too, David. And thank you everybody for watching the film and for joining us for this conversation.
Well, you know, I want to thank you because I don't know of any film like what you did with the documentary film on Broadway. And the only one that I think comes closest to it is the one I saw about Broadway musicals being a Jewish legacy. And I've just seen clips and footage from the time period of Broadway back in the heyday. And then you focus, you know, and we'll talk about that, the focus that you have. But I just wanted to start off, you know, is there anything else like this? I think what you have done has been really unique.
There isn't anything else like it. And that was sort of you could say the fun, but also the challenge that we'd gotten ourselves into doing this. As far as I know, there was a series that PBS did. It's now about 13 or 14 years ago called I think it's called like the Broadway Musical or something like that. Mm-hmm. And it was a 8-part story of Broadway from the very beginning, you know, from its earliest days through to the contemporary shows that were on the year they produced the show, which I think was around the period of Wicked. I think they were like behind the scenes of Wicked in their last episode. And they focused just on musicals, and they focused on a kind of slightly sociological, historical, critical viewpoint from the viewpoint of critics and the experts, and then a few of the living artists who were or stars who were around from the earlier stuff. But it was very much done by sort of people who appreciate the theater talking about the theater as this entity. But I didn't know of any film that looked at Broadway from inside, from the people who created the business and the shows. And that was what fascinated me as someone who's been a lifetime New Yorker and a lifetime theater goer and theater lover. And for a certain number of years, I was a theater maker. I was a director and playwright, and had never sort of seen this history told and realized that people did not know it or understand it, and that I didn't understand a lot of it. I had my preconceptions and I think we all do, kind of our biases about the kinds of theater we like and the things that we are enthusiastic about. But I didn't really understand Broadway as an ecosystem and what a sort of exciting, interesting thing that is. And I had no idea how important Broadway was to New York City, what Broadway meant to New York City, and what the sort of the rise and falls of New York's fortunes, how much they depend on Broadway and the business that Broadway brings to the city.
Yeah, I think
so that was exciting.
You bring that out so well in terms of its importance to New York, but also I think you show, I mean, the idea of seeing it as an ecosystem is something that I did want to, you know, commend you on, is that Broadway is an organic, ongoing, and fluid entity. And I think that's something that really comes through in your film.
It is. I mean, and there are certain powers that, you know, there are the powers that be that have some responsibility for shepherding it through its various incarnations and stages. But it's such an uncontrollable thing, like American society. And in some ways, over the years, it's done a really good job of reflecting American society. At other times, it's less good. and it can, then there's often a corrective where it becomes better at representing what's really going on. And, one of the biggest surprises to me making the film I had no idea really that this is what we would discover as the arc or the through line of the narrative, is that one of the biggest, I think you've all seen the film if you're listening to this discussion. The story is Broadway almost went out of business once before in around 1972, and instead did a sort of course correction, which put it on a trajectory where it's had 50 years of unprecedented growth till it's become this huge entertainment success industry. And what I didn't understand until doing this film is that there were two very surprising things about the shows that had really engineered that success or made that success happen. One is that they were, for the most part, done by very innovative artists. People who I sometimes thought of as an outsider as being, oh, those guys are just commercial. Those guys are just finding the lowest common denominator. But really they were innovators, and we'll track through later if it's interesting to people what that progression was, but they were really risk takers. And then they found Broadway producers and theater owners, money guys who were willing to invest in their chances, and it paid off. But the other incredible thing that I really had no idea about was how one of the biggest changes that Broadway underwent in the years between 1970 and 2020 is that it became much more reflective of the diversity of America, and became more reflecting what American society is like and what all kinds of people are who make up this society. And that, meant including plays that were by and about and appreciated by audiences who were women, who were people of color, who were members of the LGBTQ community, and, people had been in a way shut out, ignored, their point of view, their interests, their stories had been left out. And it was partly tying into those creative people and that incredible body of reserve of talent that had been untapped that made Broadway surge forward and be so successful. But it's also just a question of Broadway in its way, as I said earlier, kind of catching up sometimes or sometimes pushing ahead, but really reflecting what's going on in America as a whole.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask you about that, just right up front in the beginning, even though your film doesn't directly address this, but I think in some ways it's so prescient to the moment of what's going on. What do you see happening in this moment of Black Lives Matter and the racial and multicultural changes that are going on in America, or that impending, that have yet to happen? How do you see that reflected both in what you did and then in what still needs to be done?
Well, there's no question that, the audience on Broadway used to be, predominantly white and predominantly New Yorkers. And I think I don't know the statistics of the non-white audience. I used to know these when we were researching the film, and the numbers are sort of flown out of my head, but they were very low in terms of non-white audience in the 60s and 70s. And, starting, with shows that were sort of entertainment shows like Ain't Misbehavin', and then with more socially aware plays like the plays of August Wilson that we dig into with some focus in the documentary. Black audiences discovered Broadway and started coming to Broadway, and have continued to do so in ever increasing numbers. This past season, which was the most successful season Broadway's ever had, more people, I think the statistic is like 15 million we have in the end of the film. 15 million people saw a Broadway show. They made like $3 billion. A bigger part of that audience was African American than it had ever been before. And many of the artists, you as we say in the somewhere in the film, you used to be able to go to a Broadway show, and if you were a person of color, you didn't see anybody who looked like you on stage. Right. Now there's not a Broadway show where the ensemble doesn't reflect the diversity of America, racially, ethnically, sexual, preference, everything. It's like it's a much more polyglot representative.
And shows are being redone as well. like West Side Story, like um,
Well, Carousel, a couple of years
Carousel.
ago, they did Carousel with an African American in the lead. And in an interesting way, you know, there's two kinds of casting where you do that. There's sort of colorblind casting where you pretend that the race doesn't matter, and that you just like, we're going to make the leap of imagination that Richard II was African American, and an African American actor can play Richard II, because we just have to get beyond race and just see this as a work of literature, and it could happen anywhere.
Mhm.
Then there's another kind of casting where, by casting someone from a different race or a different ethnicity, it gives a new meaning and strength, or invigorates the dynamics of the script in some way, which is, I think, what happened with Carousel, is that having the lead sort of anti-hero protagonist played by an African-American man gave you all kinds of new understanding and compassion for that man's predicament, as being an outsider in this society that he was in, as being someone who was looked down upon, as being someone who was trying to get dignity and trying to maintain his place in against sort of the odds of the social class. And you know, I think it invigorated that and made it an exciting production.
And then,
But coming back to, sorry, go ahead.
no, I was just going to say, and then taking plays and narratives that come out of particular culture and ethnicity, and although, you know, done hopefully with some sense of respect, nevertheless, it's still not coming from that authentic place. And then you see West Side Story, and Arthur Lawrence, you know, did allow for Latinx actors to add Spanish and to, you know, really embody those parts in ways that, you know, had not been done before, that weren't being done in such a caricaturish way.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the other thing that you asked before was, you know, what still needs to be done? And there still needs to be, you know, more disparate voices. There need to be more plays that deal with different parts of our society, I think, that aren't always shown on Broadway. And, you know, members of the Broadway community will say this themselves. But you know, one of the biggest challenges is that Broadway is so expensive that it's excluding a lot of the public. And this is a point we make in the film, is that, you know, the challenge is people will pay for theater tickets what they'll pay, you know, and it's a business. It's not a popularity contest. And so it's hard to say to producers, well, don't charge this much if they know that they can sell the tickets for that much. But it often means that certain, you know, more underprivileged people without, you know, that kind of wealth can't necessarily all go. Although Broadway is again trying to step up and is beginning to do things like offer tickets at lower prices. Certainly for all the shows that aren't the #1 hits, you can get discounted tickets. And so you can get much cheaper tickets and more people can afford. But
Sure.
you know, it's not as cheap as the movies. And I think a lot of producers would like to figure out a way so that a few tickets for every production and every performance could be saved for people who can only play like a movie ticket price.
Yeah, and you know, you mentioned that in the film, but I think one of the great things that your film does do as well is show this business side of Broadway that drives it in terms of how just a project that will then become a play will happen, and whether in fact, you know, there's so much riding on it, there's so much money that's involved with it, that, you know, they may be reticent to do something that they don't think will be a big hit. And you'll have something like, you know, Indecent, for instance, which is based on a Yiddish play, and you know, that goes back to the 1920s, and it nearly closed because it wasn't getting the audiences that it could. So how can you put that money into it and still not know that it will, you know, get the return that they want?
Well, one of the things we allude to in the film, without sort of examining it in a lot of detail, because we didn't want to turn this into a business report, but the great thing that's happened on Broadway in the last 20 years is that there are now 5 non-for-profit theaters who are represented on Broadway, and they have different contracts. They're able to pay slightly lower fees for certain things with the unions. They have subscription audiences, so they can sell tickets for a whole season ahead of time, and they don't have the same kind of vulnerability of, is this going to be a hit or a flop? They know ahead of time they have loyal subscribers who are going to subscribe to most of their plays, as long as they do plays that are relevant to the interests of their audience. And, you know, Manhattan Theater Club is the one that we show in more detail in the play, but there's also Second Stage, there's Lincoln Center Theater, there's Circle in the Square, and I'm forgetting one. But anyway, there's another one that's
I know Steppenwolf has done quite a bit.
Yeah, well, that's the other thing, is that there are many nonprofit theaters from outside New York, like Steppenwolf in Chicago, or the Mark Taper Forum in LA, or the Old Globe in San Diego. They can develop things in a non-commercial way and bring it to Broadway. And it's much cheaper to develop and produce a play in San Diego and then bring it to Broadway, where you have step-ups for the cost of things, but the core of the work has been paid for and done, which makes it more competitive. So that enables work to get done that would otherwise not get done. I mean, Jeffrey Seller, the producer of Hamilton, before that, the producer of Rent, you know, said in our interview, look, if it wasn't for the non-profit theaters on Broadway, there would be no plays on Broadway. It would be all musicals.
Well, see, this is what your movie does so well. It shows how in that period of the 70s, looking for an infusion of work that was not only going to be relevant, but going to capture, you know, backers and connect with people and what they were living in that moment, that the nonprofits with Joe Papp, you know, really changed Broadway tremendously.
Yeah, I mean, in that stage, it was the nonprofit theaters around the country and the ones in New York, the off-Broadways, and nonprofits like the Public Theater and the Signature Theater and Playwrights Horizons. Right. You know, they would develop work which would then move to Broadway. Now you have both things happening. You still have the Public Theater developing plays. You know, Hamilton started at the Public just the way a Chorus Line did, and then moved to Broadway. But you also have Manhattan Theater Club can develop a new play like Choir Boys and then have it on Broadway. And it's, you know, otherwise it would never have gotten produced, and it won Tonys and it was a big hit, but it was also something that people wouldn't have seen as a commercial project going into it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just have to give a shout out to the place where I went to school, Circle in the Square, because Right. They were really the first. I mean, they started back in the 50s with Ted Mann and Jose Quintero, and brought Eugene O'Neill's Long Day's Journey into Night, and nobody had seen that yet. And that was really, you know, pioneering in those days.
And I think, you know, that is such an important fact in the American theater, that from the very beginning, I mean, O'Neill is really the father of serious American playwriting. And everything is, you know, he's seen as sort of the originator, and everything comes after him. And so that his play started in the nonprofit theater, you know, and just as the best plays today are starting in the nonprofit theater and then find their way to Broadway. And Broadway understands that to keep its, I mean, that was going back to the ecology, the exciting thing that I discovered is that, you know, the Broadway producers understand they could just try to, you know, there are enough shows out there, they could just do musicals that would attract tourists and make lots of money and run for years and years. I mean, it's not that easy, but there are now enough people who figured out the way to do it that you could just do those kinds of shows. But they know that if they didn't have plays that really engaged people and challenged them and were serious drama, the way American plays and British plays have been since the 19th century, then they would lose the sort of imprint of that this is an important part of our culture, and it would just become, you know, a kind of amusement park, which people already are criticizing Broadway for being, and they say, oh, it was terrible when Disney came into Broadway. But actually, Disney is a really important part of that ecosystem. Disney hires many, many, many more people of color than any other Broadway shows. They've been the most, focused on having that kind of racial balance, giving not just people in the company, but the stars, casting from the African-American community and the Latinx community. And that's made a big difference on Broadway.
Mm-hmm. And also something that hit home for me in a stronger way. I mean, I was aware of it, but I really hadn't had that power of that, was that the British spectacles that come in happen at the time of AIDS. And so many great theater people, American theater people, died because of AIDS, because of this pandemic that was going on then, that of course the government in New York City didn't want to recognize, and is shown in the play by, you know, and he just passed away, may his memory be a blessing, Larry Kramer in The Normal Heart. So here you really make, I think, a really strong point about how AIDS not only decimates the community, but then brings in a theater that kind of changes Broadway, but also moves it more towards that commercial place that you're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, that was another one of the things that I sort of stumbled onto. Again, that these things are happening around you and you're aware of them, but you don't always understand the connections. And I, lived through, I was, the first person who I knew who died of AIDS had been my teacher at the Yale Drama School, my directing teacher, who's a great Canadian director. And, in his prime had just, directed 2 shows on Broadway. And then I saw the so-called British invasion of Andrew Lloyd Webber shows and other shows, the Cameron McIntosh shows, come in and take over Broadway commercially. And, I understood that just like Chorus Line, they were important because they made Broadway someplace people wanted to come. They made it a place that people weren't afraid of coming, because the neighborhood was still pretty lousy. People were scared of the neighborhood. And this was something people were still willing to come and bring their kids because they wanted to see these shows. They found out, oh, it seems scary, but it's not that scary when you get there. You can get to the show. It's safe. You can have dinner in a nice restaurant down the block, and then you can go home and, not worry about getting mugged. But it also, it's again about the balance that Broadway seems to somehow, without having any rules or anybody regulating it, they seem to manage at the same time that they were doing, the British invasion, they were doing August Wilson. At the same time they were doing Phantom of the Opera, Stephen Sondheim was doing some musical that wasn't making a lot of money, but was, a work of art that his followers adored and that the critics loved, and that the ecosystem could but needs all these different infusions.
And also doing dramas which don't make as much money, like David Mamet or Tony Kushner, or even comedies like Wendy Wasserstein's comedies. And
I saw firsthand with some of the playwrights, with August Wilson and also with Athol Fugard, who I worked with as an assistant director in this period in the early 80s. There were producers who were committed to produce whatever they wrote. They just said, and Rocco Landisman says that in our film about August. And he owned one of the theater chains, and so he had the power and he could say it, is that we're going to produce whatever you write. We're going to make a commitment to a writer. And that was the other, to me, interesting thing about the process of doing this film, is I discovered that's really the way the smartest producers and theater owners operate on Broadway. They figure out people whose talent they believe in. And every play that person writes, or if it's a composer and they're doing a musical, every play or show they do isn't necessarily going to be their greatest piece of work. But they know that if they invest in that artist and they keep giving them opportunities, they're going to get amazing works and they're going to get their money back.
And then they build an audience as well. And that audience becomes devotees of that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's almost like having a repertory theater, except it's commercial.
Right. And, that's the, we don't go into this in the film, but that's the great drawback, the great sort of sad thing of the theater in America as opposed to the theater in England, as one of the people we interviewed explained, is in England, you're very fortunate, is that everything operates out of the same city. The movie business is in London, and the plays, the main theaters, there's a great regional theater system in Britain, and many great playwrights and actors and directors come from that, are trained there and work there and go back and work there. But the top of the profession is in London for both industries. In America, you have actors who have to live in Hollywood to make movies, and directors and writers. And then you have people who want to be on Broadway or want to write for the non-commercial theater in New York, who live in New York. And so you have this separation, and it's much harder for actors who would easily, when they're in London, they can go and shoot a film in the day, and they can go and, you know, be on set, and they can go and do their play at night. And you can't do that in New York. But
Right. Well, just going back to your movie as well, referencing that, there had been not only the protests about tearing down theaters, but a movement to create a national theater for the United States in New York. Tony Randall and Joe Papp and Arthur Miller, I think, also was writing a lot about how this was a major thing that America was missing in its culture, and looking towards London and towards England and towards the theater that they have there that's also supported by the government, which our theaters basically are not, and getting less and less these days.
It's true. I mean, it's the terrible thing about the arts in America as opposed to the arts all over the world. And I think it's one reason that Americans have become more parochial and more divided in our views, is that I think, you know, all over Europe and even other parts of the world, governments really understand how important the arts are to people. And they subsidize the arts, and they know that the investment that you make in the arts pays back in so many ways. I mean, there's no better example than Broadway of that. That although the government isn't subsidizing it, the fact that the nonprofit theaters, which are funded by subscriptions and by donations and by grants from foundations, they sustain this industry, which, you know, doesn't just support the people who work in the theater. Billions of dollars of revenue in New York from tourism and from restaurants and from all kinds of other things depend on the theater business. And small towns in America know this too. If you have a regional theater or other art stuff happening downtown, people will come to your city and, you know, go to the restaurants and go to the stores, and you'll be, you know, more money for everybody. And if you don't have a theater and the downtown starts to die, then it's all out in the shopping malls, or it goes away and people are ordering from Amazon, and you don't have either you know, a strong civic sense of being part of a city, or, you know, the revenue, the jobs that come from the businesses that are supported.
Yeah, I think you had a statistic in the film about how even more than sports, there were more people going to New York theaters and Broadway theaters than you know, it was larger than any other.
Yeah, I think there are like 20 or 25 professional sports franchises in the New York metropolitan area. And, you know, many of them are playing in huge stadiums that seat, you know, tens of thousands of people. You know, the football stadiums are enormous. And the baseball stadiums, you know, there are 2 baseball teams, and they're playing every night for 6 months of the year. But the Broadway shows in these little theaters are generating more ticket revenue than all those sports together. And you know, New York is Broadway. New York is the tourism industry in New York is based on Broadway. It's the #1. Times Square is, you know, someone told us, is the #1 tourist destination in the world, and it sure wouldn't be if there wasn't Broadway.
Right. I want to ask one more question before we take questions from our people viewing and guests who are with us today. And it's sort of the elephant in the room. We are the Miami Jewish Film Festival, but also I'm very strongly connected to Jewish theater. I'm on the board of the Alliance for Jewish Theater, and also have my own Jewish theater project. So I just wanted to kind of say it was so interesting to see not only all these Jewish names. I'm assuming I know some of them, so I know that they're Jewish, and I see other names that I'm pretty sure they're Jewish, and I see them on all sides of the aisle here in how Broadway comes together. I see them on the business side, I see them on the activist and nonprofit side, I see them in the creative side, people like Julie Taymor and others who, you know, bring their artistry as well. And I'm just wondering, you know, what do you think about the fact that there is just still, I mean, you know, it used to be said that you couldn't really get a Broadway musical done unless it was written by a Jewish writer, and that Cole Porter, you know, realized in order for him to actually become a success, he had to write Jewish. So here, this still seems to be, you know, prevalent in the on Broadway, and I think in theater overall. There's just so much engagement with Jewish life.
Well, there's no question that so many of the great talents associated with Broadway still, whether they're directors or actors or producers or designers, Jews are drawn to the arts, and Jews are drawn to, intellectual pursuits. And the theater has always been, one where there's been a community and a home for Jews, and where, where talent and excellence is rewarded financially, in terms of acclaim and recognition in the society. And, there are, so many of the great directors who are working today are Jewish. And as you said, a number of the actors are. So it continues to be a home, to offer a home. But the other part of it, again, relates to the bigger theme that we talked about earlier that's in the film. And that's, I think, it may seem corny to people, but it's the Jewish notion, the core Jewish value of tikkun olam, you leave the world a better place. And Broadway would seem to be a surprising, commercially, razzmatazz place to associate with that value. But I think that that's a very important part of what you're seeing on Broadway, is that you're seeing this impulse to leave the world a better place, to try to make Broadway represent our society in a more decent, more well-rounded way, and to make it a place where the life of the mind is explored, and where people can talk about ideas and engage in things that matter, and also go and have a great time. And
I also see, even though Jews are involved with it, and of course you'll see things that are very Jewish, like Indecent and Fiddler on the Roof, and yet you'll also see an interculturality going on between Jews and people from other cultures and other ethnicities. And I think that, is
what better example than you give is Indecent. The same director who did Indecent, then will come back and do a show that's completely, not Jewish, but embraces another community and is offering another.
Exactly. Yeah, Rebecca Teichman. So anyway, we're going to see if some of our guests have questions to ask Oren and or me, but probably mostly Oren, because I would hope you would. And so if you do, please press the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen. I'm assuming you have one because I don't. And then we'll take questions, I guess, that you will be unmuted, but you also have to unmute yourself. So I see one from Mark Yates. Mark, make sure you're unmuted and you can ask your question to everybody.
Okay, am I unmuted?
You are.
Yes.
Question. Given that this is the first time that Broadway has actually been closed down, when it reopens, what do you see? What were we going to see in terms of how theaters are run? What's going to be booked? How the theater going experience is going to change?
That's a great question, and it gives me a chance to plug the project that I'm working on right now as a sort of pro bono effort. Because I just finished this film and had these ties to the Broadway community, I'm making a small film as a benefit for the Actors Fund, where we're doing Zoom interviews like this with a bunch of people in the Broadway community, from stars like Brian Stokes Mitchell and Christine Baranski to people who are stage managers and behind the scenes and sell the work in the refreshment stands, getting an idea of what the impact is of COVID on Broadway, how they're getting by now, what they're doing. And we asked all of them this question: what's it going to be like? And nobody knows. I mean, that's the sad reality, is we don't know when it will come back. We don't know what it's like when it will come back. I mean, I think several people are asking, David Henry Hwang, the fabulous playwright and now musical writer, was saying, look, the audience has been for the last 30 years predominantly tourists, and prices have gone up and up and up. he said, maybe we'll benefit from the reset in that more Americans, more New Yorkers will start coming to Broadway, and maybe the shows will be cheaper. I mean, I think that's very optimistic, and it would be great if that's the reality. I do think we were talking earlier about the non-commercial theater, theaters like Lincoln Center Theater, Circle in the Square, Second Stage. Those theaters will, in some ways, be easier for them to come back because they can sell subscription tickets. They can figure out how close they can put people in the theaters if that's an issue. Maybe if it's testing or whatever, just coming from a more supported environment, they'll be able to put on shows. A lot of they depend on ticket sales and subscriptions, but they also depend on a huge amount upon gifts and foundation support. And I think those theaters maybe will have a head start. And so the other thing that may happen is that you may see cheaper shows. I mean, one of the things about Broadway is there's been a kind of arms race on Broadway, where Broadway has had for the last generation, since kind of the British musicals, tried to keep up with the movies in terms of dazzling people with pyrotechnics and sort of Broadway sensational effects. And a lot of the money for the cost of Broadway goes into all of that stuff. And I think we may see a more stripped down theater, at least for a while, with people for my money, getting back to the core things that we go to the theater to do, which are to be engaged by fabulous actors and great writing or great music and dancing. And that some of the trappings will get somewhat, although, there you have a challenge because a big part of the Broadway community are all of the unions which keep it going backstage, and those people need work. And so how are they going to get by? We'll need to find some ways. So I think there may be, again, a balance of big blockbuster, surefire hits that they know they can sell. They know they can open Phantom of the Opera and they'll start selling tickets right away, and keep the unions and those people supported to whatever degree they can by those kinds of shows, and then focusing on developing more of the other sort of smaller shows that are less expensive. That's just a guess. But I think we won't know till we see what's happening to the society. I mean, one of the questions is New York. People are very worried about New York coming back because without federal support at this stage, New York is going to be in much worse shape than they were in the 70s in the pictures that we show in the film, in terms of unemployment, in terms of the schools suffering, in terms of, a lot of social services and crime and other things happening, which will not make New York a likely place for people to want to come and spend their money and go to the theater.
Yeah, it's just so ironic. In your movie in the 70s there, you see Gerald Ford saying a big drop dead to New York. And this is exactly what's going on today. So, and I just want to add that of all the jobs and all of the work that I think is suffering because of this pandemic, performing artists are suffering the worst. They're the ones that not only cannot get money that will support them, but then they're totally out of their environment where they usually perform and create. And that isn't to say that creative things aren't happening. They are happening. But the funding, similarly to how Oren puts it, where the federal government, just doesn't support the arts and humanities the way it should in this country, the same thing is happening now, and the pandemic is making it worse. But I want to take more questions. If you can just keep your hand up, and then we'll answer them in the order we received it. So evidently someone had their hand up and then they put it down. And people can please continue to ask questions. Yeah, anyone?
Was it something we said?
Oh, here's something. Daniela Zanzuri.
Hi, Daniela.
Hi. I was curious as to what, I loved the movie, by the way. I thought it was fabulous. But I wondered what inspired you to make this particular documentary, and how you took and how you did your research.
Well, someone once told me delude ourselves. We think we're making choices as artists when you do one thing and not another. And he said, what you're really doing is you're giving into temptations. And that's very much what's happened to me as a filmmaker. It's sort of, sometimes I'll try to make a film and I'll devote myself to a subject and I'll knock myself out trying to do it. And I can't get funding and it doesn't work out. Sometimes it's much easier. Someone comes along and they give you an idea and it's so appealing you sort of can't resist it. And it's even more irresistible if there are people willing to pay for it. And that's kind of what happened with this film, where I went to a New Year's Day party and met a woman who appeared in the film, but then didn't like the way she looked. She's beautiful and looked beautiful in the film, but she's 91 years old and she's a little vain. And she didn't like her appearance in the film, so we only used her voiceover in one scene or two scenes. But she's the widow. Her name is Pat Schoenfeld, and she's the widow of Jerry Schoenfeld, who's a character in the film. And she lived through this whole history, and she knew there was a great, great story there. And so I met her at this party, and we started talking, and she said, you should really make a film about Jerry. And he wrote a memoir, and his story is a fascinating story. And I agreed. I thought, I read Jerry's book, and then she directed me. There was another book by a Daily News theater critic named Michael Riedel, wrote a book called Razzle Dazzle, which tells a lot of the same history that's in Jerry's book, but from a less personal point of view. He does a broader look at the period. And what I realized is they were both telling this fantastic story that I had no idea of. These parallel stories, really, of the fact that Broadway had almost gone out of business and then had changed the way it functioned and changed what its motivating principles were in a way. And that drove it for these past 50 years. And that one of the great fortuitous choices that had been made was its decision to be more diverse. And that's one of the things that kept it artistically alive and made more audiences come and made it a more exciting place. In terms of the research, the way I always make films is I read as much as I can about the subject just to get some grounding. And I mean, we didn't go into sort of great detail about my background, but my background was in the theater. I went to drama school as a director. I directed plays around the country and off Broadway in New York. And I knew the world and had friends who were, worked on Broadway. And, it's been sort of part of my being for my, as a native New Yorker my whole life. So I had absorbed a lot of the story viscerally, but then I read as much as I could. And then what I always do is I sort of throw away everything I've read. And I then identify the people who are the important people to talk to, who played a role in the stories that we're going to do. That's what the reading is most useful for, is helping you determine these are the players you have to get to. They know where the bodies are buried and you have to get to them and get them to tell you their story. And so that's what we did. We picked, it's more interviews than I've ever done for a film in my career. I've had a long career and done all kinds of films and all kinds of subjects. I've never done over 40 interviews for one film before. But we were covering such a wide period and we had to cover the whole range of experience on Broadway and the different roles, from businessmen to artists to in between, to people like, one of my favorite interviews is with Johnny Filiti, who's the head waiter at Sardi's. So we wanted to give, the real full view.
I was wondering who he was. He kept popping up there.
Yeah, he's got his ID in his lower third. He's the maitre d' at Sardi's and sometimes a bartender there.
Right.
He's our Vox Pops that gives another insight.
Right.
Does that answer your question, Daniela?
Yeah, we have another question from Mark Yates again.
Hi,
Mark. You on? Unmute.
Okay. I also really enjoyed the film and was amazed by how many interviews you got. And so I have two questions. Was it difficult to get people to be interviewed? And my second question is, what happened to the nap? How was it received?
Two fun questions. First of all, thank you for even asking about the nap. Most people would say, I never heard of this play. Why should we have this play in there? To me, it was important that we show that people will take a chance on different stuff. And that's one of the key things of the magic of Broadway. The other thing, when we started out and had done a lot of research about the play, about Broadway for the movie, one of the things I was sure was happening and that everybody from the top producers to the playwrights to old timers to new, big successes on Broadway, everybody said the big trend that's happening on Broadway is that new plays, that is plays as opposed to musicals, are disappearing. It's getting harder for them to find a playhouse because they've now adapted musicals so that musicals that used to take a ginormous stage and backstage area can be done without an orchestra, where they have an orchestra playing from a hotel room around the corner, and they pipe it into the theater, and they do these little smaller sets, and they can do a musical like Dear Evan Hansen in a playhouse. So they were saying the combination of the fact that musicals make more money, that you can do them everywhere, and that the tourists, many who come to Broadway don't speak English, means that there are soon going to be no plays on Broadway. Well, two things happened during the course of making our film. And that's one of the reasons I followed the NAP, because I want to say, how is a play going to make it in this environment? And two things happened. The first is Broadway, for some unknown reason, which no one can explain, there were more new plays on Broadway the season we covered than there had been in decades. I forget exactly the number. We have it as a card in one of the scenes we show of the NAP. But that's why we chose it, is to show that a play that's about a difficult subject with lots of reasons it wouldn't be commercial can still find a way to exist on Broadway. The play was not a huge blockbuster success, but again, it was produced by a nonprofit theater company. It ran it maintained its audience level through the run. It didn't do that badly. It wasn't the least successful show on Broadway last year, but it was far from the most successful. And it probably has a limited life because it's a play that was really written to be done in a arena theater where the seats are banked and you could look down and see the pool table. It's kind of miraculous that anybody decided to do it on Broadway. They solved the problem on Broadway by putting it on the snooker on a video screen, so you could watch the snooker being played that way. But it was done originally in Sheffield, which is not only a great regional theater in England, but it's also the home of the World Snooker Championships, in the place where they have the snooker championships. So people are used to looking down from those seats onto the snooker tables. So I don't know what kind of success we'll have since then, what kind of success we'll have from here on. I do know that the playwright has got a very exciting new play, which was about to open in London this season, which is about politics and is also very funny. And he will go on writing great plays. And so I encourage you to look for his work.
Yeah, so we'll take one more question and then we'll wrap it up. Are we hearing from anybody? Do you have your hand raised? Just making sure. Not seeing it.
Is Daniela gone? Did we answer Daniela's question? She had multiple parts. No more questions?
Daniela, you there?
Oh, there she is.
There,
Yeah,
yes,
there you are.
Sorry.
Great.
Yes, no, I'm fine. Thank you. Thank you.
So we answered everything?
Yes, you did. Thank you very much.
Thank you for watching. Glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, so I just want to say what a pleasure it's been being with you, Oren, and not only taking time to schmooze about Broadway, but also really, being able to explore the incredible gift that Broadway has given in terms of culture and the arts, in terms of its commercial potential. And now that we're in this time period, I think, there's going to have to be a reassessment. There's going to have to be some soul searching, as you've mentioned. But I think Broadway is going to be with us. I think not only because it can, but because it has to be.
Well, New Yorkers keep coming down and helping support the Miami economy. So I hope that all of you folks from Miami who are watching will do us the favor and keep coming to New York and keep supporting Broadway, because we need you and we need theater lovers around America to keep supporting the theater. So thank you very much for watching, and I hope you will keep going to plays and musicals and keep going to documentary films. It's been great talking with you.
Great.
Thank you,
so much.
David. Thank
Yeah,
you, David. It's been a pleasure. I hope we talk again.
We'll do it. We'll do it.
Okay. Be well.